Hi, my name is James Woods. I am a member of the College and Career Ready Outcomes Indicators and Measures Workgroup. But besides that particular position, I am also on the Oregon School Boards Association board. I'm a board member on the Park Rose Board of Education. I'm an economics professor at Portland State University. Our work group has been charged with putting together basically an evaluation system, what it would look like in the ideal for the K12 system. And this is a brief presentation of some of our more innovative ideas, making sure that you understand why it is that we are talking about these things and why we believe that they are correct. Let's go ahead and start taking a look at what we'll be talking about. Now, the rough outline of what we're going to be doing is we're going to first start talking about what our current system does. So we're talking about basically the Oaks evaluation system and how we use it to start saying that this particular school is a good school, this particular school is a bad school. And what we're going to do is we're going to describe it as basically what you're doing is learning on a line. We'll show you what that means, and we think it's probably the wrong way to evaluate our students and then attribute how well a building is doing. We'll also start talking about how our system is built not to go ahead and give us information about pass and fail, but it's actually built to do something else. So every system is built to do something perfectly. It's just not necessarily built to do the thing that you want it to do, and we'll show you how this is not working. And then finally, in our critique, we'll start looking at how it is that there is this fallacy of a building level effect. And we'll show you a couple of ways that that breaks down. Primarily, it's going to be that this idea of nearly identical cohorts passing through ends up being not effective, and the idea that individual students are flowing around all over the place makes it really hard to get a building level effect out of things. Next, we'll be moving on to what's possible, what our perfect system would look like. And our idea is to move away from this score-based system to something which is proficiency-based, breaking down our saying that this student is proficient into they can do this, they can do this, they can do this, they can do this, and we'll explain why that's going on. We also want to develop a system which is continuously normed and renormed. So the idea that we're going to make changes in these things, every couple of years or something along those lines doesn't seem to work for us, but we'll show you how it is that we can generate a norm and then see when it starts to deviate from what it is that we're trying to do. And also we want to tap into the vast body of teacher expertise, making it so that teachers can contribute into this in a continuous and effective way and make it so that we're still normed to the same kind of state standards. And then finally, we're going to give you a solution that you're going to hate about the quote-unquote building level problem that we identified before. Actually, we're going to give you two. And you're going to dislike both of them because both of them are imperfect on a couple of different dimensions. Now, let's first talk about the current model we have of how we measure student learning. And embedded in that is a point of view about how students learn, which we refer to as learning on a line. The idea is there is a distinct order on how you learn things, and you progress through that order of doing things, making almost no deviation. So it's always moving forward. One topic directly follows another. And this is great for a whole bunch of different kinds of learning. It could be things like you're trying to learn how to accurately kick a ball into a goal. It works for when you're trying to deal with the speed of a task, if that's something that's important to you. And that's something which is distinctly measurable like that. But the trick is that students really don't learn like that, and not all topics are laid out like that. So let me go ahead and give you a quick example right here. Consider the idea of you're learning math topics. And there's some math topics that really do start going one after the other, after the other, after the other. But suddenly you start realizing there are some things that don't directly depend upon what's going on. So for example, you could be learning here a bunch of topics, say, in algebra. And then you can jump off on another path and start making progress on some things that are going on in geometry. The things that you learn in geometry don't necessarily help you advance in the algebra part of it. There are separate tracks that we can go on. And so the idea is that it's logically true for a bunch of things. And our own current testing system admits this because we get separate scores for reading, separate scores for math. And it says that these two tracks can be parallel. Each student won't necessarily follow along at the same rate. And they're not distinctly dependent upon each other. In fact, learning is not on a line. Well, the line learning has another set of fallacies that goes along with it. The next set of fallacies that have to go with it is that, in fact, we don't learn on lines. What real learning looks like is that you go ahead and learn a couple of topics, and then you find out, oh, you just didn't get that thing. You learn some more stuff. You have another thing that you just couldn't figure it out, and then you learn some more stuff. And while you're learning this thing over here, you suddenly realize what's going on over here, and you in fact learn it. You fill in a gap after the fact. So again, you can progress a little bit more again, and while you're hanging out over here, you go ahead and go, oh, that's what that was about. And you go ahead and fill in that particular gap. So learning isn't exactly a linear process. Those gaps can kind of hook you up if your measurement isn't really good at gap detection. Now the other problem with our learning on the line is that it views it again as this really linear process where you keep on going forward. But the secret is that you don't always keep on going forward. What happens is that you forget things. So it could be after you've made a bunch of progress, you may go back and find out you've completely forgotten about this topic right here. Now those of you who have taken classes know that this is a common thing to happen. It's you're getting ready for the final exam and you realize, good God, you've forgotten everything that's gone on in the second week of class. It happens, you forget. So there's kind of a forgetfulness process built in here. And unfortunately, this has a bad impact on our system because we're teaching skills often a long ways away when students were supposed to have learned them. Oftentimes they need a quick little review, kind of like your review sessions that you used to have before your final exams in order to say that you really did learn this. In fact, you did, you're just a little bit rusty on it. So I think you'll agree with us that this learning on a line concept doesn't exactly work. In fact, we're going to fix this with replacing it with a bunch of really small topics, things which are a little bit closer to where you're learning them, so you can demonstrate a kind of proficiency with them. Now let's talk about how we're evaluating our current system, our current OAT style system. And what we're doing here is basically trying to create a system where we can take a score and figure out if a student has passed a certain cut point that's sitting around right here. Okay, so lower scores are down here, higher scores are up here. And if you look at the distribution of the scores, and so what I'm talking about here is a histogram, and I apologize if I'm throwing any of you off with things that sound like stats language, but you know, you've got this histogram, bars which show the count of students that have actually gotten a particular score within a certain range of scores. What our current system does is that it attempts to make scores that have equal variance, equal uncertainty about each score. So for low scores like this, the bound of uncertainty is that big. And for medial-sized scores like this, it's about that big. So it's all supposed to be the same all the way across, no matter what your score is. And that's great if you're actually worried about what these individual scores are. The thing is, we're not. What we're concerned about is, are the students on this side of the cut score or on students on this side of the cut score? And the most efficient way of doing that is not to have this equal variance across the entire range, but in fact, the best way of doing it is to make it so that your variance, your uncertainty about those individual scores actually shrinks when you're far away and gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you get closer. So the idea is that if you have an individual that's out here with a really, really low score, you're pretty sure that they have not gone ahead and met the cut score. And so your uncertainty about those scores doesn't need to be very precise. You can go ahead and have a great deal of uncertainty. You just know that student's not making it. Same things with these students way out over here. You can have a lot of uncertainty about those scores because your worry is, did you pass the cut score? And we don't need to have that kind of precise information about those individuals. But the idea is that closer you get to the cut scores, the smaller your uncertainty needs to be in order to say, yes, you did or did not pass the cut score. And in fact, when you get really close, we should have these incredibly precise kinds of measurements of individual students. So again, if we're worried about just this measurement of proficiency, whether you manage to go ahead and satisfy a standard, what we need to do is to move not towards tests which give you a number, but towards tests which give you a pass or no pass designation. And while we make it so that we're very sure that we didn't accidentally go ahead and take people that should have passed and put them in the no pass category, and take people that shouldn't pass and put them in the pass category. In other words, what we're trying to do is minimize the type 1 and type 2 errors, the classic kind of statistical designation. And so it's because of this little effect that we're getting here, this focus on whether you have or have not passed a standard, that we're going to be moving towards some proficiency-based measures and measures which are pass, no pass only, without these additional numerical scores. Now let's talk about one of the fundamental problems we have, and that's the problem we have of saying that a certain building is failing and a certain building is not failing, doing well and not doing well. And we've been kind of doing this a really strange way that doesn't make sense from program evaluation. The basic model is that we have this population of students that we're taking a look at. And these students right here go ahead and they get measured. And then what we do is that they move on to the next year. And so that puts them kind of a different category. So this new group of students has gone through. And then what we do is we look at the next body of students that's coming into the same grade. And this body of students is, you know, pretty similar to the other one. So I'm going ahead and making them go here in orange, but they're not exactly the same. And what we're saying about the building effect is that are you making the orange box better than the red box over time? And then this group of students will go ahead and move on to, and they'll move on to another grade also. So this comparing the orange box to the red box at the same place isn't exactly holding things in statistical control. It doesn't capture it. And in fact, when you're trying to go ahead and do an evaluation, you have two choices about control. You can have either strong experimental controls or strong statistical controls. A strong experimental control means that you can go ahead and take each individual and place them exactly where they need to go in order to isolate an effect. In this case, we're trying to isolate a school effect. If we want to isolate a school effect, we can take a population of students then, and by an experimental control, we can randomly assign them to two schools to find out which school is the better school. We can't do that here. What we can do is do something that's better than this particular system right here. And what we're doing is something that's called a differences in difference approach, which is one of the standard approaches that you have when you have only quasi-experimental control. And what you do in this case, in order to find out what the effect of a school is and if it's improving over time, is you look at this particular change that happened from one grade level to another and compare it to this change that happened from one grade level to another. So you compare this difference to this difference, the difference between the red group and the difference between the orange group, and you can see how they have grown over time. And this is embedded in that idea of looking at the growth statistic. And again, this growth statistic is more directly embedded in program evaluation, particularly quasi-experimental design, and it's more recommended than just simply looking at the differences in two grades right here. Now the second part of the fallacy is that we can go ahead and actually get to a building level effect by just watching these particular cohorts. Well, the problem is that we may have one of these great cohorts right up here. Pretend that we've got the orange one back down here. But the problem is that these cohorts don't stay at a particular school, not all year long and not from year to year. There are plenty of schools that just explicitly lose half of their cohort. Only half of the students that are there for the entire year. And so what those students end up doing is moving on to cohorts in other schools. They move from this part to over here. They may move to this particular cohort in that school, this cohort in that school. So going ahead and saying that you have these students that are at individual schools is a little bit crazy when only half of them are there for the entire year. What's even weirder is that each of these schools over here has students that are also leaving during the course of the year. Forget about during between year to year. And these students are moving to other places and basically mixing in with everyone else. So to say that, you know, we can watch this individual cohort is just a little bit crazy. It's something that's not practical for our students. And then finally, we have this added difficulty is that what is that quote-unquote building effect supposed to be? Because once you're within a school, you'll notice that the teachers change around. Teachers have powerful effects on the students. And in fact, one of the stories that you get once you start looking at performance data is that the variation in teacher performance within a school is much greater than the between-school performance. If you're looking for a good education for your child, your best bet is not to move schools, but to choose the path that your student takes through the teacher cadre at an individual school. So that means what we have to do is control for individual teacher effects. And I can see that many people will be reticent to do this. And after you've extracted the teacher effects, what you would be left with is the building effect. And the building effect is primarily the management effect of the individual principal there. And it's kind of been shown in the literature that this management effect can be significant for kind of middling teachers. And it's not very significant when you have a nice good cadre of teachers there already. So the composition of teachers will give you an idea of what the scale of the building effect should be and which direction of the building effect should be. So that's the fallacy of building level. We have a way of difficult to kind of attribute a quote-unquote building effect when in fact we believe that there's this incredible amount of mixing. We're not using true quasi-experimental methods, and at the same time what we're actually measuring is a principal effect and not a building effect. Now here's the first of our ideas on how we feel that we should be changing things. What we'd like you to do is move away from the idea that you're going to go ahead and have a census. That means basically test everyone. We know that there are some things that we do have to test everyone, but our idea is that let's do the absolute minimum of this. It is probably not the best way of using our evaluation resources, and it doesn't actually give you as much information as you wish. So our hope is that for anything you're going to do a census of, it is the absolute minimum possible that will satisfy the current legal requirements that's there. Now, given that we're going ahead and going to say that, let's go ahead and tell you why it is that we believe sampling is much more effective. The reason why sampling will always look more effective to us has to do with this little notation that comes around over and over and over again. Every single time you do statistics, usually when you're trying to figure out what the uncertainty about a number is, you end up at one point seeing the square root of n. And that n is going to be the number of observations that you have. So the upshot of this is whenever you're looking at statistics is anytime you do something crazy like multiply the number of observations by 4, what happens is that what you're doing is reducing your uncertainty by a half. Anytime you add observations, increase your sample size, your next observation gives you less information than the previous questions you had. So let me ask you a question. Would you rather go ahead and double your sample size and get half as much information as you had before, or start going ahead and doing a test on something totally different and have just as much information on that topic? So what you're saying is that sample makes it so that we can actually test for the same amount of money lots and lots and lots and lots of different topics that aren't on the main line, and we can actually go ahead and have a larger body of information about more things. We'll just have more uncertainty about each one of those, and because of that square root of n problem, that uncertainty will be less than the total uncertainty we have if we devoted all our resources to testing these individual topics. That's why we're aiming for sampling here. And what's nice is that when you're engaged in sampling, if you have a reduction in your budget that's related to evaluation, you don't do some very drastic things like not test 4th graders on writing or something along those lines. What you do instead is change the sampling rate from, say, 70% to 60%. You still end up with a lot of information, and the reduction of information isn't quite as drastic just because that square root of n rule over here works to your advantage in that situation. You lost information, but you didn't lose so much because it was only on the latter kind of observations. The second part that we want to bring into it is that sampling doesn't have to be random sampling. You can actually engage in something that is stratified. Stratification means that you can go ahead and, to a certain extent, choose how you're going to randomly assign who gets sampled. So an example, classic statistical example of why you would stratify is that that you've got 3 groups that all have exactly the same average, whatever that may be, and you know that one of the groups has a higher variance, one of the groups has a middling variance, and one of the groups has a lower variance. Well, your instinct to go ahead and just randomly sample from each of the groups is great, it'll work, it'll get you the right answer, but it's not the most effective use of your dollars. If you know about these variances ahead of time, you can sample more heavily from the group that has high variance and less heavily from the group that has a low variance, and make it so that you in fact have greater certainty about what the mean is with the same number of observations. And so this is a statistical trick that you use. The other thing that you can do with stratification is change how you stratify based upon the risks inherent in the system. What are the consequences of failure? What are the consequences of being wrong? So if you have a population where you feel that it is very damaging not to actually have them, not to have accurate knowledge about what it is they're doing, take for example special ed students, then you can more heavily sample those things than you would the other students where it's not quite so damaging. In fact, if this is the case, you have to go ahead and make a value judgment on how you're going to do that. So our preference is to make it so that we will not in fact be testing everyone on everything, but we can go ahead and allocate our resources, our testing resources, into allocating a relatively thin line of exams for absolutely everybody, and then taking the rest in order to say, have an evaluation on chemistry, have an evaluation on physics, have an evaluation on poetry, have an evaluation on lots of different topics if we're trying to find out what the health of a building is and what the status of a building is on this particular topic, or what a district is doing. So that's the first idea that we want you to come back with, is that by sampling, we can learn more about more things with the same dollars. Now the next innovation we want to bring to the table is changing the form of the exam. Currently what the exams look like is a giant monolithic super exam. And you can think of it as being the equivalent of a final exam, except it's over the entire year, not just in a term and not just on a one particular topic that's there. It's kind of alarming. If you've ever been through these things, that you know that you're unlikely to remember the stuff from the beginning of the term. You need to have review sessions to get there, but this is what we're doing to our students. This doesn't seem to make sense to us. So what we're advocating is not these giant super exams, but little mini exams. Mini exams on individual topics that are given in proximity to when they are learned. So instead of taking this giant test, you learn something about the community of property, and near that you're given a little test that's part of the state evaluation. Something that go ahead and takes you like 10-15 minutes. Something which can be graded on a pass, no pass basis, and this is a very key feature right here. And then what you can do is you can move on, learn some other topics, and then you get another little mini test that's part of the overall state exam. Something that again also takes 10 or 15 minutes. Something that's also graded on a pass, no pass basis. So we're looking at breaking up this monolithic system into these competencies in math, these competencies in English, these competencies in writing, and going ahead and saying that you've demonstrated it in this topic, this topic, this topic, this topic, or to use the language that's used now, you've demonstrated in this strand, in this strand, in this strand, in this strand. What's nice about this system is that if you're concerned about that forgetfulness process that we talked about, you can go back and give students those particular exams again, or some ones that are similar to it, as we'll demonstrate how that goes. But again, breaking things up, giving the tests near where you learned them, having them graded on a pass, no pass basis, so that you can go ahead and say that this student has competency in this area. And in fact, this gives us much better information about individual topics and doesn't make it so that it is so onerous. As an added benefit, it means that these things which are, we intend them to be almost summative, can be used as a formative exercise, because the teacher can go ahead and see what the results are of these individual exams and go, wow, I need to change my grading practices for tomorrow and do something different for these particular students because they're clearly having difficulty with this particular state standard. And again, we're making it so that the formative assessments count towards what's going on for the summative assessment of what's going on in that building and district and the state itself. Now, given that we started talking about all these little mini exams that you give multiple times, you probably were wondering where they were coming from. And you always have noted the kind of difficulty that's there creating an exam that folks are to agree upon. Well, what we're advocating here is that the state system go ahead and, when requested, create basically a little mini exam on an individual topic, something that supposedly fits the state standards that's there. And if they requested something else, then create another little mini exam and another little mini exam, all on slightly different topics. And these are in fact the standard that's there. But what we want to have able to happen is to have the local districts and local teachers developed also mini tests that are normed in the same way. So you can picture each one of these things being given to students in the state, and again, we're engaged in a sampling process here, so they are being given in a way that is relatively low cost. But then what happens is that, say a teacher wants to work on this particular topic and actually wants to develop their own exam. And the idea to get it normed to the state standards is that what that teacher needs to do is quickly develop their own exam, give that exam to their students, some of which will already have taken it, and then what you need to do is have a quick evaluation of it. In fact, what you end up doing is saying that, look, we've got the state test here, we've got the local test here, we have those that pass, and we have those that don't pass. Little twiddle means not. And we can look at the distribution of the scores in here. And if we have strong agreement on who passes, and we have strong agreement on who does not passes, and there are strong statistical measures for this, it's referred to as an agreement test, we can say that this local test that the teacher developed is adequate to evaluate the state standard that's here, and other teachers can use it too. And so it's a requirement of making your local test be valid for saying that you've passed state standards. It has to first pass the agreement, and you have to basically donate it to the state so that other teachers can use it. So the idea is that a teacher will go ahead and create one of these, another teacher will go ahead and create another exam, another teacher will create another exam. Each of those exams will in fact be normed up to the state standard that's up here, making it so that lots of people can use all these other exams that are out here. And so basically what we're trying to do is crowdsource all this information that we have out there in order to create a testing environment which keeps getting better and better and better. Now, because when you're using these tests in order to basically norm up to the system, you have to be entering the data into the system. What it essentially does, it starts to tell us if some kind of exam starts to get out of line because it's been overused. So we can go ahead and say, well, look, this test used to be really good at identifying those that would pass under the state system and those that would fail under the state system. But what's happening is that suddenly that's breaking down and we're ending up with a little additional noise. And so in effect, the results that go in can actually potentially decertify one of the tests because it has been used too much. Students are learning what those particular questions are. In fact, faculty may be learning those kinds of questions. And so they can quickly decertify themselves. This means that when teachers, if they have an incentive to deviate from the rules, it makes it so that their exams will be decertified and potentially it'll make it so that the results they're turning in are also equally decertified because they're too far out of control. So the exams that they're giving are not reflective of some of the ones that are evaluated on the state level. So what this does is that it makes it so that this grand set of state evaluations is not necessarily dictated from the top, but a standard is placed there, and then the teachers themselves can create a wide variety of assessments, all evaluated pass, no pass, to make it so that we can determine if an individual student is satisfying this particular strand or satisfying this particular strand. Again, this is for those individual mini tests and not for the giant, huge test that's hiding around right there. So again, teacher-centered, continuously renormed exams. And we had quite a long discussion on how to deal with things which are, by their nature, subjective. This could be the things like a quality of creative work, something along those lines. But it could also be things like, what is your general appreciation of how well prepared are these students in order to satisfy middle school work or to have academic work? And there's actually a wide body of literature on how to do this, but the key is that if you are looking for these subjective measures, that you have to have many different observations of them. And so you have to have somebody come in and make an evaluation, so A, B, and C will go ahead and make evaluations, and commonly you'll end up getting some kind of Likert score and say, well, it's clearly a 3, and this one will clearly say, oh, it's a 4, and this one will say it's a 3. And what you do is you evaluate these guys right here with something that's called an agreement stat. And if they deviate too much from each other, you know that they are out of agreement and they need to have a powwow on what the standard actually means or what kind of evidence they've been using. And again, they have to do this independently and they can't know what's going on with anyone else. So that's one way of handling it. Another way of handling it is to go ahead and actually just focus on one of these guys right here, or look at some things which are observable. And by observable it is suppose you're looking for, well, are these students actually academically prepared to handle middle school work? The things you may do is, well, does this particular student turn in something that looks like homework on time, 80% of the time or more? Does this student participate in these particular ways? And you can develop a whole lot of these little indicators and then use them to later on find out whether they actually did succeed in middle school in this academic sense. And while this seems like a little bit crazy, what you're doing is you're saying, look, there's these things that are going on fairly early on. We're trying to find a statistical relationship between what we can observe now and what we can observe later. And so basically the data rolls in later in order for us to test hypotheses about these indicators. So the longer the system goes on and the more ideas that individual teachers have about what indicators to watch for, because teachers have plenty of these ideas, we can go ahead and test those individual ideas against the absolute other results that are there. Again, this may seem highly unusual to folks, but trust me, systems like this have been used in order to do things like create orchestra halls. Again, I'm trying to get to the engineering story here, is that they're sound engineers were trying to figure out, well, what makes a great orchestra hall for, particular kind of music. And what they did was that they decided all the things that they could measure about an orchestra hall, went and measured them, and then asked people, again, experts, is this a good hall, is it not a good hall, is this hall better than this hall? And they found out which of those characteristics that they could measure were correlated with making a good hall. What they did is they built a hall that had the characteristics that made a good hall, and then asked, is this a good hall? And it turned out that it was. So what we're doing is engaging the same process, observing some characteristics, hypothesizing that they're going to indicate this future state of this particular student that we have right here, and then testing to see if in fact those characteristics were good. Those that were good we keep, those were not good we jettison as being an indicator of what this subjective evaluation is supposed to do. So again, that was another innovation we wanted to bring to the table. Finally, we wanted to address the problems of small districts, where it feels like sampling could in fact be extremely difficult, or it would be difficult in order to have all these tests because there's this vision that we're dealing with large schools with large populations. To a certain extent, in a small district, things are easier. There's something that's called the small sample adjustment, or rather the large sample adjustment. And what happens is when the sample that you draw is a large fraction of the population, it makes it so your variance actually shrinks a lot more. Second, we don't necessarily have to give all the tests to all students to know what students are doing in certain areas. So there is again, a statistical trick that's called a multiple imputation. And to a certain extent, you can see this going on in the census. If you take a look at the census direct observation file, the 1% file that's there, a lot of those columns aren't there because you don't have data from all people on these particular items. People just don't answer all the questions. So what they've done there is engaged in something which is called hot deck. And so what they do is they look for somebody that's nearly exactly like the person that they're missing a piece of data for. It could be age, and then what they do is go ahead and pop in the age of that one. What multiple imputation does is it kind of takes that to a logical result. You pick a body of people that are very similar, except for the missing characteristic, and then you at random grab one of those numbers and pop it in, and you do that for one data set, and then you go ahead and you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And what happens is when you start evaluation the means, and when you start evaluating any kind of statistical model off it, you effectively average over all of these separate data sets in order to get not just a measure of the expected value of a population parameter, but also your uncertainty about what you were putting in those particular boxes. So multiple imputation can be used as a statistical trick for these other districts when we can't do so much of this sampling and so much of this testing. Now here's the big problem. The problem of going ahead and getting at building effects. Now, we're stuck with several problems. One, we have the mobility of the students, and so we know that students are moving from building to building to building to building to building, so we can't exactly measure a cohort. We have individual teachers being much more important than the quote-unquote building, and at the same time we need to have something which is easily explainable. We don't have something that does all of that, but we can come to a compromise. Now the first thing that we want to do is say that, well, what's the best solution if we didn't have to explain everything? The best solution that we have to explain anything is kind of a regression model on what a student did in a particular test, and it's an observation about what they did on a particular test before. So this is a time period before, t-1. As well as some things that have to do with like, oh, we had an observation from teacher A, and they're busy being embedded in school D, or something along those lines. And you can find these individual teacher effects, and also how well they've done since the previous observation, by just going ahead and looking at a series of regression parameters that are associated with each of these things. And this is a classic approach, and this little rough model that I've drawn out here isn't something that anyone would actually estimate. In real life, you have to do things like take into account that student assignment to classrooms isn't, how should I put this, random. Students are placed in classes for specific reasons, because of parent choice, because of teacher choice, because the teacher has certain characteristics that are good for this particular student. Second, mobility is not something which is exogenous. A student doesn't enter or leave just at random. It happens because of certain things which are important to what the student is. So if a student has low socioeconomic status, if they are somebody that's poor, that's going to have an effect on whether they're moving frequently. Low-income people will tend to move more than high-income people, and this will also have a drastic effect on what's going on in their education. Also, mobility effects will be not the same depending upon how the move's being made. So for an example, an individual that moves into a school because one of the people in their household, lost their job, lost income, it'll have a different effect than what happens when they move because someone got a job and they moved to a different school in a higher income neighborhood. So again, any kind of real evaluation system like this will take into account heterogeneity, endogeneity, and all this kind of other stuff that you normally don't see in the education literature, but you do see in the economics of education literature. So it needs to be a lot more sophisticated. Problem, we can't explain this to everybody. And in fact, we're lucky to explain it to a bunch of graduate students. So this is a difficulty. We can actually get a good idea about what's going on. And in fact, we can find out what that actual building effect is, abstracting from the teacher effect, but we can't explain it to anybody at all. So here's where we got a compromise. And the compromise is that we can do that differences in difference approach with the cohorts. But we're going to have to give you a lot of different data. We're going to have to tell you what was the change in performance of students that were there from one year to the next at the same school. What was the change in performance of students that were there from part of the year and moved from a totally different school? What were the graduation rates of students that have been at the high school for 4 years, been at the high school for 3 years, been at the high school for 2 years, been at the high school for a single year? So we're going to have to give you a lot of different kinds of data on what the quote-unquote building effect is. And what we can do is we can give you comparators to schools and districts which are similar to the ones that are there. So we can go ahead and get some kind of rough agreement that's there. However, well, this seems like it would kind of work. Let's go ahead and take the athletic point of view. If you've ever watched any kind of high school sports, you've seen what happens depending upon what league you're in. So you can look at the 6A teams and the 5A teams, and you may see a school that's at the very bottom of the 6A table. And it's always going to be at the bottom of the 6A table because they just barely made 6A status. And you know if they were just moved into the 5A group, they would be state championships. But they would be the state champions. This is likely to happen with a comparative system. So if we are going to make these comparisons between quote-unquote like schools, we have to realize that some schools are just barely making it into those comparison categories. And some schools have really no comparators, and so saying that they're the absolute best really doesn't make any sense because there's no school that has that high socioeconomic status that we can compare them to. And so what we're advocating here is that yes, go ahead and make the compromise. Go ahead and compare them to schools that are alike on many different dimensions, not just the ones we're currently used, but be prepared to put an asterisk on each of those evaluations. Think about it as these asterisks on 20% of the population of the districts or buildings that you're looking at will say, we really don't have a comparison for this. But you can always keep the sophisticated regression analysis in the background in order to improve what you do and do not put the asterisks on. So if you have any questions and you want to discuss this further, please feel free to give me a call. My name's James Woods. You can catch me at woodsjam@parkrose.k12.or.us, and that's my Park Rose Board of Education email address. I'm perfectly willing to arrange an appointment to talk about these ideas more with you. Thank you.